All right, well, welcome to this webinar where we're going to be talking about 3 essential birth prep advantages that you might be underestimating and what you can do about it. My name is Amy Burks, and I am a birth doula and childbirth educator. And I have been a birth nerd, I would say, for at least the last 12 years, which started with my own experience in my first pregnancy with my oldest daughter, Victoria, which you can see here. This is my family. My husband, David, will be celebrating 13 years now in October. And then you have Amelia and Julia. I actually have 5 children, 2 boys in heaven. And so and then my daughter is bringing me our furry baby. This is Dash, who he just turned 1 a few weeks ago, and we have had him almost a year now in um, a week before Thanksgiving, I want to say. So um, before we get started, I just want to share a little bit more about my background. Like I said, I've been studying birth and supporting moms over the last 12 or so years, a little more intense as the years have gone on, and doing it more as my profession in the last 6 years. And so I have been trained as an NRP, which is neonatal resuscitation, training to be able to provide that during a birth if we need it, for a baby, and CPR trained as well. I have worked as a midwife assistant in the birth center, one of the local birth centers here, and with some of the local midwives here as well in Central Florida. And I previously taught a childbirth education course that used hypnosis, but after some personal study as a Christian, I found that I had different convictions about it and decided not to teach that anymore moving forward. And so right around the time of COVID was when I actually took a pause in my birth work, and that's when letting go of that hypnosis course happened as well. And so it's been kind of this journey of figuring out how I wanted to pursue my birth work over the last, I'd say, year to 2 years, since I've been considering relaunching and getting back in. So that's just a little bit about me and my family. So 3 birth prep essentials. These are things that you may already have on your radar, but you may not even realize just how important they can be and how influential they can be to your overall birth experience. One of the things that we talk about when it comes to birth are really working through your fears and anxieties. And as most first time moms or moms who are maybe having their first vaginal birth after cesarean, or just moms who haven't had a baby in several years and want to do things differently, there are some common things that they share in those fears and anxieties. And some are concerned about pain, especially if someone's wanting to do an unmedicated birth after having an epidural with their first, they question their tolerance of pain. Will they be able to handle it? They worry about complications during birth. They have fears for the baby, for themselves. Dad sometimes is worrying for both at the same time, mom and baby, and how to make decisions on their behalf if there should be some kind of emergency. Um, some moms are worried about tearing or things like that. Others aren't bothered at all. But one of the biggest things that I find that in my line of work that people seek doula and childbirth education support for is with this question of, how do I avoid any kind of birth trauma? You go to the baby shower, or you're having your baby shower, and people want to just tell you all the stories about their birth experiences and the things that either they went through or a story that they heard about someone's birth. And hopefully most of those stories are all positive stories with positive outcomes, but sometimes you can hear some of like the worst case scenario things, and those things sit in the back of your mind of like, oh man, what would I do if that happened to me? And so these are things that, whether they're loud thoughts in our head or whether they're super quiet in the back of our mind as we move forward confidently in what we want to do, these are things that sometimes leave us vulnerable if we don't look at them and address them, um, by answering how we would respond in those situations. So I personally have found that the three essential birth prep advantages are having your ideal birth plan, getting education and getting your preparation, and having the right support team. Now, these are three things that I see a lot of people do one or two of, but it's unless I'm working with them, I find that sometimes they are not doing all three at the same time or with the same level of focus. And that is something that I'll share later, is something where I've seen just some disadvantages from not making sure that there was focus given to all three, what I would consider parts of the dynamic trio, is how I'll refer to them. So education and preparation, your support team, your ideal birth plan. I really was struggling with like, what order should I talk about these in? Because they all kind of coincide with one another. You want to have an ideal birth plan, and we'll get into more specifics of what I specifically mean about that. But in order to know what to even put on your birth plan, you need to have your education and preparation through classes or your own personal research, stories from other people, their experiences, and then also having the right support team. But how do you know who you should have on your support team if you don't understand how your support team influences your birth? So I find that it's more of this cycle and a dynamic trio that we're working with. So to start us off, we'll start with your ideal birth. I emphasize your, okay? There can often be times where, especially in the work that I do, where we can be very geared toward only natural, unmedicated, out of hospital births because, you know, the statistics show that that's kind of the ideal. If you want to have this perfect low intervention birth or whatever, that's where you're going to get it. But that isn't always the case, as I was kind of mentioning in conversation before we got started. Some moms really do feel safer in the hospital, and they are still able to have natural and medicated births there if they want to. Some moms are able to avoid any kind of birth trauma because they were able to take advantage of things like the epidural. So I say your ideal birth plan because it's what you desire, how you envision your birth going. One of the things that we'll also get into that I bring as a doula into my work is my perspective and worldview as a Christian. So I really hold heavily to the reality and truth that I believe in, which is that God is sovereign overall. So maybe you know what that means, maybe you don't. So in essence, what that means is that God is in control of all things. So at the end of the day, we make our plans, but what he wills to pass is going to pass. And so, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't plan and that we shouldn't prepare, right? So we do our part and we trust God with the rest of the details. And that's kind of like my motto as we go on here. Um, so when it comes to your ideal birth plan, as I started, it needs to be your birth plan. How do you envision your birth going? When you think about birth, what comes to mind? Is it pictures like what you see in the movies of the mom going crazy and screaming, telling her husband, like, you did this to me? Or do you picture something more peaceful and something that is just quiet and easy and natural? What are the things that come to mind, and really paying attention to that? Do I notice that I start to cringe up when I think about birth, or do I feel at peace and settled and confident about it? Paying attention to that and really just addressing that. As again, where I would bring this in as a Christian is to not just look at that on your own in your own thinking, but bringing that in prayer to God, and just working through any fears and anxieties that you may notice you're having when you think about birth, or thanking him for the peace that he's provided you already as you prepare for your birth. Some of the things that you'd want to include in your birth plan, you can find tons of free templates online. This is not anything that you need anything fancy from me on. So I'll put that out there. I'm not going to hold I forget the terminology, but I'm not going to keep that from you. So you can easily Google birth plan template where it's already pre-written for you. You can get creative and use something like the Canva app and put pictures or whatever works for you, but having some kind of plan. I suggest 1 to 2 pages long. Um, the easier to understand, like bullet points, the better. And what you want to include are things like how you want your newborn cared for. For example, if you're having a hospital birth, they may go into autopilot and give your baby a bath themselves. And you may prefer for you to be the one to give the baby their first bath in the hospital, or you may prefer not for the baby not to have a bath at all until you get home because you want the baby to be able to get all of that natural microbiome and things from the vernix soaked into their body. Um, and so I will have some interruptions because I have children, excuse me, but okay, I'll need to wait. Um, so with things like that, you'll want to make sure that you list your newborn care information, whether or not you want delayed cord clamping, and being specific. Do you want the delayed cord clamping to be 2 minutes, 10 minutes? All of that kind of detail are things that you want to include because while the hospital or your home birth midwife or birth center may have certain evidence-based practices or standard practices that they go by, you may, from your own research, have different preferences. And at the end of the day, you are in charge of your birth. You, even though there are professionals making decisions and all of that, you do have the final say. So you can say no, you can say yes, you can say this is what I want, this is what I don't want, and that needs to be listened to. You are the one who holds the power in that birth room in the sense of who's in charge. Obviously, again, I would lean toward God's sovereignty over the details, but you are the one who's going to be asked to make those decisions. And that's another reason why it's ideal to have a plan, because if you're in labor, then you probably don't want to be trying to advocate for yourself and explain what you want, what you don't want as you're contracting. You want your spouse or your partner to be able to have the answers to that already in mind because you've discussed that previously before going. And also, if there happens to be any type of medically necessary intervention, you already know what your next steps are and all of that. And that gets into the plan B intervention options. Those are things that you would include in your plan. This would kind of be your partner's guide that they would hold on to and keep in their back pocket for themselves to know, like, okay, I can't interrupt her and ask her this because she's focused on her contractions. We already talked about this when she was calm, cool, and collected a few weeks ago. So we have a plan, and I can make those decisions on her behalf comfortably and confidently. And then another thing I would just highlight, sometimes is not included in the birth plan templates, is to be clear on how you want the medical team to engage with you. You can put things like whether or not you want a naturally minded nurse if you're in the hospital, or whether or not you want the birth assistant coming in and out of your birth room at the birth center frequently or to be monitored as frequently. There are things that you can still decline, even in those settings, if you're not comfortable, or if you prefer not to have cervical exams done, or to have a specific medical professional do the cervical exam over another because it feels more comfortable to you. These are all things that you can communicate. But again, putting it as far as on your birth plan, you can say things like, um, I would like a naturally minded nurse, or I would like very little in and out of the room so that I can focus and have quiet. You could say things like, when you walk into the room, please be quiet. I will have worship music playing, or lights on. Please do not turn the lights on, things like that, those kind of details. Okay. The next one is education and preparation. So with education and preparation, I would encourage you to consider taking multiple classes. As I said before, I used to teach one specific course, and we limited it to only being able to take that course. You were not allowed, you had to sign an agreement that you would only take that course. And that was something that I found myself differing on after the fact. And that's because there's so many advantages to equipping yourself and getting more tools in the toolbox for whatever scenario. One way may not work, and it's good to have other options in place. And so, one of those classes, obviously, being for your pregnancy and birth, preparation for what to expect during labor, how to care for yourself postpartum, things like that, how to know you're in labor before you go to the hospital or the birth center or wherever you might be giving birth. Classes on breastfeeding, if you can take that locally with an IBCLC, or if you can, or a lactation consultant, or if you can do any kind of newborn and breastfeeding classes like combined online, where you can just watch on-demand videos to kind of learn what are the ideal positions and things like that. Perhaps you plan on breastfeeding and no one in your family ever breastfed, and so you're kind of alone in that and trying to figure it out. You don't want to be stressing, you want to be as knowledgeable as you can so that you're prepared and understand that when you're having those stressful moments or babies may be having difficulty latching, or you're just feeling a little bit frustrated because how the baby latched before is no longer working this time, you're already prepared because of the class to know this is normal, this is natural, you are not failing as a mother, your baby is okay, and you guys are going to figure it out together. And you can have that confidence rather than filling up that, the load of insecurity that sometimes as moms we can already kind of have with a newborn baby. The next thing I would say with education and preparation along with those classes is to get to know your provider. So sometimes, especially if we're working with midwives, we can tend to, in my opinion, put our guards down because we think, oh, they're a midwife. They automatically are going to approach this exactly how I want it to. But in my experience, that is not always the case. Most of the time it is, but not always. And we don't want to assume things. So it's important to ask questions like, how would you handle this kind of emergency? When would you make this call? When would you, if you find out baby is breech, is that an immediate transfer to the hospital, or is that an immediate C-section if you're already at the hospital? Or do I have options to birth vaginally? Asking questions maybe to your OB, what is your C-section rate? There's actually a website called leapfrog.org, I believe it is. I'll try to find the link and include it in my follow-up email to you all. But that lists just about every hospital and their different ratings on different categories. So there is where you could find the hospital's C-section rate and kind of have an idea of whether or not you're comfortable birthing there given those statistics. But getting to know your provider, and sometimes like in an OB practice, you have more than one provider, or, in a birth center as well, you may have several midwives, and everyone's going to approach things differently. Everyone's call it bar, like when I'm going to make a change or last minute decision and move a different direction, that it's different among different providers. And so asking those questions to each one of them and finding out what they're comfortable with is super important and helps you to know whether or not you're still on board and in line with your care provider, or whether or not you want to consider finding someone else while you still have time. If you are in the situation where you're trying to decide whether you should switch from one provider to another, or from one birthing setting like the hospital to a home birth, or home birth to hospital, vice versa, and you want to talk about that, we can definitely get into that, and I can help you kind of navigate what that might look like for you depending on how far along you are. And then we have your support team. So choosing your support team wisely. So some would say, it is said, it's one of the sayings in the birth realm, that for the amount of people that you have in the room, that's how many hours you should add on to how long you're going to be in labor. So I remember with my first birth, I had my mother-in-law, my mom, my father-in-law was behind a curtain. I had my husband, I had the OB, and then the nurse, and like so many people. Because I just thought I want everyone with me. With the next few births, I was like, no, I just want me and my husband. And then if I hired a doula, some of them I did, some of them I didn't. Then I wanted the doula there, but after that, I was like, no, you can come in after baby's born. So you just kind of figure out what you're comfortable with. Some people they feel kind of invigorated and like have energy to kind of get through labor by having more people in the room, at least during, early labor or things like that, or having them over at the house. While later into labor, they might feel like they just want to be alone in a room. So just kind of having a plan right now of what you think that will look like, but then also leaving room perhaps when you go into actual labor for changing your mind. I had that with the last birth I attended. Originally, she wanted her son to be there at her home birth. And then as she got into labor, she realized, actually, I don't. And because we had a plan in place of who we would call and they knew to be ready just in case she changed her mind, we had family come over, pick up her son very quickly and take care of him. And so those are things to just be thinking about and why you should be choosing your support team wisely. I'm going to assume that your partner, your spouse, is going to be at the birth by your side unless, they're serving overseas in the military or something like that. So that's someone for sure that you is likely, especially if you're married, they're likely going to be the person who is allowed to speak on your behalf if the medical staff can't get answers from you as you're in labor. And so making sure that he is on board with everything in your birth plan, that you guys have discussed it, and that it doesn't come as a surprise to him, or that it's not something where he's like, I have no clue what this means. It's on here, but I guess like you want him to be just as knowledgeable about that birth plan and everything on it as you are, so that he can feel confident too as he speaks on your behalf, um, if needed, to the medical providers. Um, Okay. If for some reason we get knocked out of here, just go ahead back to the same Zoom link, excuse me, that we were in. But encouraging your support team to take classes. Another thing, something that I tend to offer to my clients, especially if they want to have moms at the birth, or a parent, a mother or father at the birth. Usually it's the moms. The wife's mom will usually be there. Is especially if she hasn't experienced or witnessed a type of birth that the mom is planning to do, is we do this kind of parent support class to prepare them for what it's going to look like, how they can support you, what's normal and natural, what's to be expected, what's cause for concern, things like that. And I find that that's really helpful in alleviating any concerns that parents might have with their children who have chosen a different birth plan and direction than they chose years ago. And so that's something that, I also encourage you to do if you plan on having a parent at your support team. Um, and then just the biggest thing, as I've already stressed, is making sure that that your spouse, that your mom, whoever is going to be at your birth, including if you have a doula, making sure that everyone is on board with your plan, that there's no kind of like, yeah, you're saying that, but this is what we're actually going to do. No, that you are at the end of the day are in charge. You get to decide if you change your mind about getting an epidural or not. If you decide that you want to, not stay at the birth center and you want to go to the hospital because something in your gut is saying like, I'd feel safer there or whatever, that you are the one who gets to make those decisions. Because at the end of the day, one of the things when it comes to birth trauma is that you find yourself, especially when you're in labor, you are in a very vulnerable state. And so the more support you can have of people who are just going to affirm and encourage what is already safe. Again, this is all within the balance of everything is good and fine with mom and baby, that they're going to support your wishes and listen to you, rather than, kind of overriding you or downplaying the things that you're saying. It's important that everyone take you seriously in that birth room. And so we come back to this dynamic trio that I was talking about. I mentioned that I was going to share just a couple of stories. So I'll share two stories of where I saw this go wrong in a birth and where I saw this go really right. And so the first would be I'll preface this to say both births were in the hospital. So the first birth, I had a client come from another country. So her spouse was not with her, but she was staying and being supported by her spouse's family. And I was actually hired by her sister-in-law to come and be her doula. And so we didn't meet until she made it here to the country, and it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks before she went into labor. Now, during that time, she already had taken childbirth preparation classes. She hired someone for support, me as a doula, um, and she was ready to go. So she had her birth plan and all of that. So she had these three things hypothetically in place. But one of the things where that really kind of caused her plan and this trio to deteriorate was who she had as support as well in the room. And so there were some family who were very much not on board with her plan and what she wanted. And so although she was doing really well, laboring, baby was fine, she was fine, uh, family was actually able to influence the doctor, since they had been the one who hired them, to make some decisions that did not involve the mother's consent and led to unnecessary interventions and some issues later on for the baby. And so what started as this beautiful labor, mom doing really great on her own, became this what they call iatrogenic, where the interventions and the issues that rise are due to the medical team getting too involved and actually messing up the process. And so, that is just one example of why I say it's important to make sure that everyone in that room is on board. Because when people are tired and they've been watching you be in labor forever and they just want to get this done and over with, and they see you struggling, they're going to try and figure out a way to solve it for you if they're not on board and realizing that it doesn't matter how they feel, but what matters is that you are comfortable and your desires are being followed. And then a more positive birth story and outcome would be another client and who also gave birth at the hospital. She had talked to me about how her OB had suggested induction, but she didn't want to go. And so, because she was educated, because she had gotten support, a solid support team who trusted her and supported her in her wishes with her partner and also me as her doula. And then because she had a plan in place of how she wanted things to go, she was able to make a lot of really informed decisions and give some informed refusal to her provider, which they had a little bit of a hard time with, to be honest. But never was she or the baby in danger. And so part of the concern was an ultrasound that was done later in the closer to like 38 weeks, and baby was measuring big. She didn't have any concern about it. Baby was not actually big according to the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology standards, which is how the OB should be following or making decisions. And so they ended up declining the induction, going to the hospital, laboring just fine. And the OB came in and again said, this baby is too big. We need to do a C-section. And the mom just felt super frustrated, was really thrown off by it because she was laboring, no problem whatsoever. And so because we had already gone through education and preparing, I was able to remind her that you can say the magic words, which are, I do not consent to your care, and get a brand new provider. And so she chose for herself and with her spouse that was the best thing for them. And she did that, and she had her baby vaginally. Baby was 7 pounds, not big at all. And she came out of what could have been a traumatic birth, but came out empowered and really happy with how she was able to advocate for herself in that experience. And so those are two different scenarios of how this trio can work for you if you really put the time into it and get your team on board, or not, and have unfortunate traumatic situations that can happen. That's the extreme But those are the things, I think most of us, when we come into a class like this, we want to learn because we want to avoid that. So, um, as I said, create that ideal birth plan, your ideal birth plan. Get your education and preparation for your birth so that you can know what is reasonable to have on your birth plan, what to include, what's not important to you, that kind of thing. And then having that solid support team, the dream team that's going to back you up and be there for you, whether things go really well or whether you end up at your plan Z. At least at the end of the day, you can leave there feeling I was listened to, I was supported, and I have a support team who's going to help me get through this regardless of how things went.
Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that the information in it was beneficial to you and that you have left with at least one takeaway that you can start applying immediately. If you're not already, go ahead and follow me at Purposely Entrusted Motherhood on Instagram to stay up to date on things that I'll be sharing, future webinars, and such. I'm also really excited to share that soon I will be launching my Confidently Prepared Birthing course, and I would really love for you to be part of that. So, to stay up to date on when more information comes out, be sure to give me a follow. Thanks.